Social identity theory. Studies using the minimal group paradigm have shown the pervasiveness and persistence of in-group favoritism, but what does it have to do with the motivational perspective on prejudice? Might it not reflect a purely cognitive tendency to divide the world into categories of us and them? Just as all children quickly learn to distinguish the self from all others, might we not also all learn to distinguish my side from the other side? Much of the psychology between in-group favoritism might very well reflect these kinds of cognitive tendencies. The us-them distinction may be one of the basic cuts people make in organizing the world. Still, the in-group favoritism observed in the minimal group situation can't be the product of cognition alone. For that we need a motivational theory, a theory to explain why, once the us-them distinction is made, we treat those we consider us better than those we consider them. Some divisions into us and them have the kind of material or economic implications discussed earlier, which often provide motivation enough for people to treat in-group members better than out-group members. But not all motivations are economic, and certainly no meaningful economic implications are present in the in-group out-group division in the minimal group paradigm. To explain that sort of in-group favoritism, a different motivational perspective is needed. The most widely recognized theory that attempts to explain the ubiquity of in-group favoritism is social identity theory, which is based on the idea that our self-esteem comes not only from our personal identity and accomplishments, but also from the status and accomplishments of the various groups to which we belong. Being an American is an element of the self-concept of most Americans, and with it may come the pride associated with, say, the Bill of Rights, U.S. economic and military clout, and the accomplishments of American scientists, industrialists, athletes, and entertainers. With it, too, may come the shame associated with the country's history of slavery and its treatment of Native Americans. Similarly, being a gang member, a professor, a film buff, or a surfer means that our identity and esteem are intimately tied up with the triumphs and shortcomings of our fellow gang members, academics, film buffs, and surfers. Social identity theory. The idea that a person's self-concept and self-esteem derive not only from personal identity and accomplishments, but also from the status and accomplishments of the various groups to which the person belongs. Social identity theory. People derive their sense of identity not only from their individual accomplishments, but also from those of the groups to which they belong. A. These delegates at the U.S. Republican National Convention identify with the Republican Party. B. These individuals derive part of their identity from belonging to the community of surfers. So in A, you can see an audience, and they're all raising their hats at a Republican convention, and at B, you can see a bunch of surfers standing and posing together with their surfboards. Boosting the status of the in-group. Because our self-esteem is based in part on the status of the various groups to which we belong, we may be tempted to boost the status and fortunes of these groups and their members. Therein lies a powerful cause of in-group favoritism. Doing whatever we can to feel better about the in-group leads us to feel better about ourselves. Evidence supporting this idea comes from studies that have assessed participants' self-esteem after they've had an opportunity to exhibit in-group favoritism in the minimal group situation, such as the one described earlier where participants awarded pairs of points to overestimators or underestimators. As expected, those who had been allowed to display in-group favoritism had higher self-esteem than those who hadn't had a chance to boost their own group at the expense of another. Other research has shown that people who take particularly strong pride in their group affiliations, such as feeling particularly proud to be an American, are more prone to in-group favoritism when placed in a minimal group situation. And people who are highly identified with a particular group react to criticism of the group as if it were criticism of the self. Basking in reflected glory. Social identity theory also receives support from the everyday observation that people go to great lengths to announce their affiliation with a group when that group is doing well. Sports fans, for example, often chant, "We're number one" after a team victory. But what does "we're number one" mean? It's a rare fan indeed who does anything other than cheer their team, heckle referees, or taunt opposing players. Yet countless fans want to be connected to the effort when the outcome is a victory. After a loss, not so much. Robert Cialdini refers to this tendency to identify with a winning team as basking in reflected glory. He investigated the tendency by recording how often students wore their school sweatshirts and t-shirts to class after their football team had just won or lost a game. As expected, students wore the school colors significantly more often following victory than after defeat. Cialdini and his colleagues also tabulated students' use of first-person versus third-person references. It's no surprise to learn that, as a general rule, we won, whereas they lost. As social identity theory predicts, the triumphs and failings of the groups with which we affiliate affect our self-esteem, even when the group is simply a favorite sports team. We therefore have an incentive to identify with such groups when they do well, but to distance ourselves from them when they lose. Victory finds 100 fathers, but defeat is an orphan. Count Gilesio Ciano, The Ciano Diaries, 1945. Basking in reflected glory. Taking pride in the accomplishments of other people in one's group, such as when sports fans identify with a winning team. Basking in reflected glory. Sports fans, like these Ohio State students, passionately identify with their team and feel joyous when the team wins and dejected when it loses. To connect themselves to the team, fans often wear team jerseys to the game and even to class or work the next day if the team wins. So you can see a crowd at a football game going wild and wearing jerseys. Denigrating outgroups to bolster self-esteem. To bask in reflected glory is to use in-group identity to enhance self-esteem. But does denigrating outgroups also boost self-esteem? Does criticizing another group make people feel better about their own group, and hence themselves? Indeed it does. In one study, researchers threatened the self-esteem of half the participants by telling them they had just performed poorly on an intelligence test. The other half were told they had done well. 1997. The participants then watched a videotaped interview of a job applicant. The video made it clear to half the participants, none of whom was Jewish, that the candidate was Jewish, but not to the other half. Participants later rated the job candidate, see Figure 11.3. Participants whose self-esteem had been threatened rated the candidate negatively if they thought she was Jewish. Participants whose self-esteem was not threatened did not. Figure 11.3a. In addition, the participants whose self-esteem had been threatened and had taken it out on the Jewish candidate experienced an increase in their self-esteem from the time they received feedback on the IQ test to the end of the experiment. Figure 11.3b. It appears that denigrating members of outgroups can indeed bolster self-esteem. Lisa Sinclair and Ziva Kunda explored a related way that outgroups are strategically used to enhance self-esteem. In this study, non-black participants were either praised or criticized by a white or black male doctor. The investigators predicted that the participants would be motivated to cling to the praise they received, but to challenge the criticism, and that they'd use the race of their evaluator to help them do so. In particular, the investigators predicted that participants who received praise from a black doctor would tend to think of him more as a doctor, a prestigious occupation, than as a black man, whereas those who were criticized by a black doctor would tend to think of him more as a black man than as a doctor. The participants performed a lexical decision task right after getting feedback from the doctor. The researchers flashed a series of words and non-words on a computer screen and had the participants indicate as fast as they could whether each string of letters was a word. Some of the words were related to the medical profession, for example, hospital, prescription, and some were associated with common stereotypes of blacks at that time. 1999, rap, jazz. Sinclair and Kunda reasoned that if the participants were thinking of their evaluator primarily as a doctor, they would recognize the medical words faster. If they were thinking of their evaluator primarily as a black man, they would recognize the words related to the black stereotype faster. As figure 11.4 shows, that's exactly what happened. Participants were particularly fast at recognizing words associated with the black stereotype when they'd been criticized by the black doctor, and slow to recognize those words when they were praised by the black doctor. Figure 11.4a. The reverse was true for the medical words. Figure 11.4b. Participants were fast at recognizing medical words when they'd been praised by the black doctor, and slow to do so when criticized by the black doctor. When the black doctor criticized them, in other words, participants saw him as a black man, and when he praised them, they saw him as a doctor. Alternative construals. Do you see this person mainly as a man, a doctor, a black man, a black doctor? How you see him may depend on how each construal contributes to your self-esteem. So it's a picture of a clean-cut man who is dark skin and has a stethoscope and a lab coat and a tie and a name tag and looks like a doctor. Figure 11.3, bolstering self-esteem. A. The average ratings of a job candidate's personality, depending on whether the candidate was Jewish or non-Jewish, after the person doing the rating had received positive or negative feedback. The results demonstrate that feeling down on oneself, a rater who had received negative feedback, can make a person more likely to denigrate the outgroup, rate the Jewish candidates more poorly. B. Raters who had received negative feedback and subsequently denigrated the outgroup received a boost in self-esteem from doing so. Okay, in figure A, so these are side-by-side bar graphs. On the x-axis is job candidate, and the two sets of bars are Jewish candidate and non-Jewish candidate. And then the bars are divided into positive feedback and negative feedback. And on the y-axis is ratings of candidates' personality from 0 to 100. So you can see that participants receiving negative feedback denigrated the Jewish candidate. Okay, so you can see that when the candidate is Jewish, if the participant got negative results on the IQ test, they only like the Jewish candidate less than 70%, but if the participants got positive feedback on the IQ test, they like the Jewish candidate almost 90%. And if the candidate is non-Jewish, there's no difference between the sets of bars for positive and negative feedback. B. Okay, so it's another side-by-side bar graph with two sets of bars. You still have job candidate on the x-axis with two side-by-side bars for Jewish candidate and two bars side-by-side for non-Jewish candidate. And the y-axis is now measuring increase in self-esteem from 0 to 6. And the bars are broken into positive feedback for each type of candidate and negative feedback for each type of candidate. And so you can see negative ratings of the Jewish candidate boosted participant self-esteem. So the increase in self-esteem when it was a Jewish candidate and you had gotten positive feedback were 2. But when you had gotten negative feedback, the increase of self-esteem when the participant was Jewish was 5%. And for the non-Jewish candidate, when you got positive feedback, the increase in self-esteem was 2. And when you got negative feedback, the increase in self-esteem was 1.5, so not significant. Figure 11.4, self-esteem and racial prejudice. Participants were either praised or criticized by a white or black doctor. Reaction times to black words and medical words after criticism or praise by white doctors were virtually the same, but participants were quicker to recognize black words when they had received negative feedback from the black doctor, and quicker to recognize medical words when they had received positive feedback from the black doctor. Okay, so A is a side-by-side bar graph with two sets of bars. On the x-axis, you have feedback, positive is two side-by-side bars, and negative is two side-by-side bars. And on the y-axis is reaction time in milliseconds to recognize medical and black words after receiving feedback from a black doctor, so from 530 to 630 milliseconds. And the two sets of bars one is medical words, and one set of bars is black words. So you can see that participants who had received positive feedback from the black doctor were faster to recognize words related to medicine. Okay, so if you look at the graph, when you receive positive feedback from the black doctor, it takes 570 milliseconds to identify medical words, and it takes 620 milliseconds to identify black words, showing that you're associating the doctor more with medical words. And when you get negative feedback, it takes you 590 milliseconds to respond to medical words and only 565 milliseconds to respond to black words, showing that you're associating the black doctor with the idea of being black instead after receiving criticism. Okay, graph B, it's another side-by-side bar graph. On the x-axis is still feedback, positive or negative, and on the y-axis is reaction time in milliseconds to recognize medical and black words after receiving feedback from a white doctor, between 530 and 630 milliseconds, and the one set of bars is medical words and the other set of bars is black words. So you can see that participants were equally fast at recognizing words related to medicine and to black stereotypes, regardless of whether they received positive or negative feedback from the white doctor. Okay, so the two sets of bars for positive and negative are basically identical, showing that it takes participants, whether they receive positive or negative feedback, about 600 milliseconds to identify medical words, and whether they receive positive or negative feedback, it takes them about 590 milliseconds to identify black words. So there's no change in whether they receive positive or negative feedback from the white doctor. Social identity theory also maintains that group memberships are part of every individual's identity. If so, then people will often be motivated to denigrate out-group members, not just when they personally are under threat, but when their groups are. Studies confirm this prediction. When white Americans or Canadians are made aware of the changing racial demographics of their country, they express more negative attitudes toward minority groups, increased implicit pro-white bias, and less interest in affiliating with members of non-white groups. This, of course, was a much-discussed element of the 2016 presidential election. The part of the electorate who felt they were losing ground economically and culturally were thought to be most receptive to Donald Trump's harsh rhetoric about immigration. Looking back, consistent with the motivational perspective on stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination, people are inclined to favor in-groups over out-groups, even when the basis of group membership is trivial. Part of the reason is that people identify with their groups and feel good about themselves when they feel good about their groups. Threats to self-esteem also result in a denigration of out-group members. The cognitive perspective. From the cognitive perspective, stereotyping is inevitable. It stems from the ubiquity and necessity of categorization. People categorize nearly everything, both natural, bodies of water, creek, stream, river, and artificial, cars, sports car, sedan, SUV, even color, which arises from continuous variation in electromagnetic wavelength, is perceived as distinct categories. All of this categorizing has a purpose. It simplifies the task of taking in and processing the incredible volume of stimuli surrounding us. The American journalist Walter Lippmann, who is credited with coining the term stereotype, stated, "The real environment is altogether too big, too complex, and too fleeting for direct acquaintance. We are not equipped to deal with so much subtlety, so much variety, so many permutations and combinations. We have to reconstruct it on a simpler model before we can manage with it." 1922. Stereotypes provide us with those simpler models that allow us to deal with the great, blooming, buzzing confusion of reality. Stereotypes and the conservation of cognitive resources. If stereotypes are useful schemas that enable us to process information efficiently, then we should be more inclined to use them when we're overloaded, tired, or mentally taxed in some way. In other words, when we're in need of a shortcut. Several experiments have demonstrated exactly that. In one intriguing study, participants were more likely to invoke stereotypes when tested at the low point of their circadian rhythm. Morning people, when tested at night, tended to invoke a common stereotype and conclude, for example, that a person charged with cheating on an exam was guilty if he was an athlete. Night people, when tested in the morning, were more inclined to conclude that a person charged with dealing drugs was guilty if he was black. Thus, people are more likely to fall back on stereotypes when they lack mental energy. Not surprisingly then, people have also been shown to stereotype others more when they're intoxicated with alcohol and their mental capacities are low. If the use of stereotypes conserves intellectual energy, then using them should free up extra cognitive resources that can be applied to other mental tasks. In one test of this idea, participants performed 2 tasks simultaneously. 1994. On one task, they formed an impression of a hypothetical person described by a number of trait terms presented on a computer screen. For example, rebellious, dangerous, aggressive. The other task involved monitoring a tape-recorded lecture about Indonesia and then taking a quiz on the content of the lecture. For half the participants, the trait terms were accompanied by a stereotype associated with those terms, such as skinhead. For the other half, the trait terms were presented alone. The key questions were whether presenting participants with the stereotype would help them later recall the trait terms they'd seen and, more importantly, whether being prompted to stereotype would also release extra cognitive resources that could be devoted to the lecture on Indonesia. As the experimenters anticipated, the use of stereotypes made the first task easier and thereby freed up cognitive resources that allowed them to perform better on the second task. Figure 11.5. Those given a stereotype not only remembered the relevant trait information better, but also performed better on the test on Indonesia. Figure 11.5. Conserving cognitive resources. Providing participants with an applicable stereotype makes it easier for them to recall stereotypically consistent information, thereby conserving mental energy for use in performing other tasks, such as the quiz on Indonesia. Okay, so this is another side-by-side bar graph with 2 sets of bars. On the x-axis is subject of memory test, and the first set of bars is about trait-relevant information. The second set of bars is about Indonesian economics and geography. On the y-axis is number of items recalled from 0 to 10, and one set of bars is the stereotype was provided, and the second set of bars, no stereotype was provided. So you can see, participants with a stereotype that could be applied to a person they read about recalled more trait information about that person, as well as more information about Indonesia on another test. Okay, so when you look at the set of bars about trait-relevant information, when a stereotype was provided, they remembered 4.5 items, and when no stereotype was provided, they only remembered 2 items. So the stereotype helped them remember trait-relevant information. And then when you look at the second set of bars on Indonesian economics and geography, when the stereotype was provided, subjects remembered about 9 items, and when no stereotype was provided, subjects only remembered about 7 items. So you can see again, when the stereotype was provided, they could remember more about the Indonesian economics and geography lesson. So the stereotype helped with both types of learning. Construal processes and biased assessments. Not every member of a given category conforms to the group stereotype. So while relying on stereotypes can save time and effort, it can also lead to mistaken impressions and unfair judgments about individuals. Social psychologists have produced countless demonstrations of this point. A simple and particularly unsettling example comes from an early study by John Darley and P.H. Gross, 1983. They had students watch a videotape of a 4th grader named Hannah. One version of the video reported that Hannah's parents were professionals and showed her playing in an obviously upper-middle-class area. Another version reported that Hannah's parents were working class and showed her playing in a rundown environment. The next part of the video showed Hannah answering questions involving math, science, and reading. Her performance was ambiguous, She answered some difficult questions well, but also seemed distracted and flubbed easier questions. The researchers asked the students how well they thought Hannah would perform in relation to her classmates. Those who saw an upper middle class Hannah estimated she would perform better than average, while those who saw working class Hannah assumed she would perform worse than average. What's especially sad is that these assumptions about a student's performance, based solely on her social class, are grounded in fact. On average, upper middle class children perform better in school than working class children. Therefore, given an ambiguous performance by a child, we might reasonably anticipate her long-term academic success would be greater if she's upper middle class than if she's working class. The reason is that working class Hannah starts life with 2 strikes against her. People will expect and demand less of her and will perceive a given performance as worse than if she were upper middle class. Moreover, the mistaken impression about Hannah will tend to reinforce the stereotype that working class children are less academically able than middle class children. Biased information processing is especially harmful when the stereotypes on which it's based are completely lacking in validity. If people suspect, because of something they've been told or the implications of a joke they heard or a misinterpreted statistic, that a particular group of people might differ from other groups in some way, it's shockingly easy to construe information about an individual in a way that confirms that suspicion. The stereotype is then strengthened due to confirmation by the biased observations, a vicious cycle indeed. Why is it we never focus on the things that unite us, like falafel? An Israeli and a Palestinian sitting together on a bench with the same background talking. Distinctiveness and illusory correlations. As we noted in Chapter 4, people sometimes see correlations, relationships between events, characteristics, or categories that are not actually related, a phenomenon referred to as illusory correlation. Illusory correlations can arise for many reasons, with some being simply the result of how we process unusual or distinctive events. Distinctive events capture our attention. We would notice if a student came to a lecture wearing a clown outfit or nothing at all. Because we attend more closely to distinctive events, we're also likely to remember them better, and as a result, they may become overrepresented in our memory. These processes have important implications for the kinds of stereotypes that are commonly associated with minority groups. By definition, minority groups are distinctive to most members of the majority, so minority group members stand out. In addition, negative behaviors, such as robbing, assaulting, and murdering are, fortunately, much less common than positive behaviors, such as saying thank you and obeying traffic signs, so negative behaviors are distinctive as well. Negative behavior on the part of minority group members is therefore doubly distinctive and doubly memorable. Minority groups are therefore vulnerable to being stereotyped as more likely to engage in negative behavior than they actually are. David Hamilton and Robert Gifford, 1976, explored the impact of paired distinctiveness, the pairing of 2 distinctive events that stand out because they occur together, in an experiment that examined the formation of such illusory correlations from scratch. Participants were presented with information about the actions of members of Group A or Group B. These were the only group labels they received. These were not existing groups they were familiar with, such as theater art majors, North Americans, or heterosexual or transgendered individuals. They learned, for example, that John, a member of Group A, visited a sick friend in the hospital, and Bill, a member of Group B, always talks about himself and his problems. Mimicking real life, most of the actions by members of each group were positive, 69% to be exact. Thus, there was no correlation between group membership and the likelihood of positive or negative behavior. But 2/3 of the actions they read about described the actions of someone in Group A, thus making A the majority group. When later asked to remember who did what, participants overestimated how often the negative behaviors were performed by a member of the minority group. They also rated members of the minority group less favorably. Even though participants knew nothing about these 2 arbitrary groups beforehand, and even though they were exposed to the same ratio of positive and negative actions on the part of both groups, they came away thinking that the smaller group did more bad things. Figure 11.6. A distinctiveness-based illusory correlation became lodged in participants' minds, that is, they detected false correlations based on the distinctiveness of minority group members and the distinctiveness of negative behaviors. Subsequent research has shown that beliefs in such illusory correlations can be formed on the basis of a single instance of unusual behavior by someone from a minority group. If you've seen few Polynesians in your life, for instance, but you see a Polynesian curse at the bank teller serving your line, you might be tempted to conclude that something about being Polynesian was at least part of the reason. I guess that's just the way they are. Of course, if a member of your own ethnic group behaved that way, you probably wouldn't consider ethnicity as a possible explanation. Every group has some jerks. Members of your group do plenty of obnoxious things as well as wonderful things, but being a member of your own group doesn't normally count as an explanation for any specific behavior. Paired distinctiveness, the pairing of two distinctive events that stand out even more because they occur together. Figure 11.6. Distinctiveness and illusory correlation. Distinctive events, such as negative actions by members of minority groups, tend to stand out and exert a disproportionate influence on judgments. In this study, participants attributed more of the negative behaviors to the minority group than the members of that group were actually responsible for. Okay, so it is a side-by-side bar graph, and on the x-axis you have positive actions and negative actions, and on the y-axis you have over and under attribution from negative 2.5 to positive 2.5, and the two sets of bars are majority and minority. So when you look at the category of positive actions on the x-axis, you can see that the amount of positive actions done by the majority group is underrepresented by negative 0.5, and the positive actions done by the minority group are overrepresented by 0.5. And in terms of negative actions, the majority group members are underrepresented by negative 2, and the minority group members are overrepresented by 2.25. So you can see that in both cases, the majority group members are underrepresented in terms of their positive and negative actions, and the minority group members are overrepresented in both their positive and their negative actions, but they're much more overrepresented in terms of their negative actions, similar to how the positive group members are much more underrepresented in terms of their negative actions compared to positive actions, which don't have as much of an under or overrepresentation. And that makes sense because the negative actions are more distinct. And of course, being a minority group member is also more distinct, giving you paired distinctiveness. Paired distinctiveness. A. When we see unusual actions performed by people we rarely encounter, such as, for Westerners, these Vietnamese children, we tend to wonder whether those people are fond of that type of activity, and a link between the two is often formed. B. When the same actions are performed by types of people we encounter frequently, such as, for Westerners, a child from the United States, we don't draw any conclusions about those people. So you can see in the picture of the left, Vietnamese kids are on stilts. On the picture on the right, a white American child is on stilts.